Good evening, everyone, colleagues, members of the campus and the wider community, students and friends. My name is Elsa Manatidou. I'm the Director of Modern Greek Studies at Brown, a program that includes Professors Graham Oliver, over there in the corner, Johanna Hanning, in that corner, and Vangelis Kalotichos, right at the back. These are the program faculty that are here with us today. So feel free to corner them later to talk about Brown MGS. Today's event is co-sponsored by Modern Greek Studies, the Department of Classics, the Music Department, and the program in Middle East Studies at Brown University. We are grateful to them, as well as to our departmental staff, Tiffany Lewis and Justine Brown, for taking care of all the logistical details, big and small. Many thanks to Summer back there, who is going to be expertly handling the camera for today's event. And of course, our friends from Media Services and the Hellenic Students Association, ably led this year by Theodoros Karanikolas over there. Thank you all for adhering to the Brown University health protocols, which require that you keep your masks on when indoors, unless you are speaking or singing. Because of health protocols, we are unable to offer our customary hospitality in the form of a reception, but we will linger after the talk, and you can chat with Dr. League or ask him questions. Today marks a doubly auspicious occasion because of what we're about to listen to, but also because this is the first Modern Greek event that we are having in person since February 2019. We have missed you. On behalf of Brown MGS, I'd like to welcome all of you who are here today to delight in this cultural and musical extravaganza that Dr. League has in store for us. And those of you who have to write a critical response to today's lecture, I hope you remember to keep notes. Let me turn now to our illustrious guest for today. Dr. Panayotis League, or Paddy League, is Assistant Professor of Musicology, Director for the Center for Music of the Americas, and Associate in Ethnomusicology and Folkloric Studies at Harvard University's Center for Hellenic Studies. He specializes in the traditional music of the Greek islands, northeastern Brazil, Ireland, and their respective diasporas. He holds a PhD in ethnomusicology from Harvard University, where he also served as the James Notopoulos Fellow in the Milman Parry Collection of Oral Literature. Dr. League's research has been supported by grants from the Fulbright Foundation, the Weatherett Center for International Affairs, and the Tsakopoulos Hellenic Collection at Sacramento State University. His first monograph, one of many to follow, I'm sure, Echoes of the Great Catastrophe, Resounding Anatolian Greekness in Diaspora, was recently published by University of Michigan Press, and it is for sale at the bookstore. The book project, which began as a close reading of the music performances of a single migrant family, expanded to a transnational study of the musical cultures, practices, and perspectives of the Anatolian Greek diaspora. And I will leave it to Dr. League to explain to us what he means by the collocation Anatolian Greek. What I would like to offer as a teaser before we hear Dr. League speak is that as I was reading the book, I was struck not only by Dr. League's meticulous attention to the details of his ethnographic study, his contagious captivation by his subject matter, the resounding of an intercommunal Ottoman past, but also by his humanity, his affective engagement with the communities that he studied and performed with, and his own candid reflections and meta-commentary regarding his own positionality as a North American researcher from an elite institution working within these communities. Dr. League, otherwise known as Opadi Omeraklis, performs traditional Greek music and other throughout Greece, Europe, and the Americas. As you can see, he plays every instrument you can imagine. I ask for permission. And another one. As an Anatolian Greek myself, and a fellow board member in the Modern Greek Studies Association, where Paddy also serves, I have had the opportunity to enjoy his erudition and his musical genius on several occasions, including after conferences, after-hour parties. Let's see whether the Brown students can play Spot the Brown Professor. I can assure you that we are all in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming Dr. League to the podium.
Thank you, Professor Matidu, for the extraordinarily generous and slightly embarrassing introduction. Thank you for subjecting this unsuspecting audience to my mustache from when I was an undergraduate. But thank you very much. It's really a delight and a pleasure and a great honor to be here. So thank you, Professor, for the invitation, and thank you to all of the many entities, and both collective and individual on campus that made this happen. And I'd especially like to thank, I don't know if she's here or not, but Tiffany Brown, who helped me immensely in terms of coordinating all the technology and this kind of thing. So, yes, I wrote a book, and it's out in the world, which is it's just after so many years of working on this and thinking about it, it's really quite a wild thing to unleash. And this is the first time that I've given a talk about this research post-publication of this book. So rather than recap the entire book for you, I decided because we're in this space tonight, represented, all of you, my hosts, and my friends, you represent various academic, intellectual, philosophical traditions that intersect in my work. I decided to focus for this talk on one particular aspect of this project. So that's the name of this talk, as well as the name of my book. So first of all, let me define a few terms that will be helpful and save us some time. As Dr. Manatidu pointed out, I'm using the term Anatolian Greeks, which is not a terribly common one. We often talk about, we often use these kind of geographical designators to talk about Greek ethnic groups, although that's a little difficult in the modern Greek context to discuss. But we talk about, for example, Cretans from the island of Crete, or people from the province of Epirus, or people from the Pontus, which is where Professor Amanatidu's people are from the southern coast of the Black Sea. And then there's this general blanket term, Asia Minor Greeks, that we often hear, that means pretty much all of the Greek-identified people from Asia Minor, the continent, or the Anatolian Peninsula. I like the term Anatolian Greeks because I think, in my mind anyway, well, first of all, it comes from the people themselves. My interlocutors in the English-speaking Anatolian Greek diaspora in this part of the world, in New England, particularly Boston, when speaking English, often use that phrase themselves. I suspect it's from the Greek word Anatolitis, which means Easterner, more or less, but in the historical region of Aeolia, the northwestern Aegean coast of modern-day Turkey and the island of Lesvos, which is what I'm focusing on. On the right-hand side, these are two historical maps, one Italian map from 1569 and an Ottoman map from the famous Piraeus world map collection. And on the left, of course, a screenshot from Google Maps with the island of Lesvos circled. So when I talk about Anatolian Greeks, I'm talking about people who very explicitly trace their ancestry and their cultural and philosophical and spiritual heritage to that part of the world, the island of Lesvos and the associated islands and the mainland, the Aegean coast of Asia Minor right across from it. Okay? More or less the historical region of Aeolia. So I decided for this presentation I'm going to focus on one particular aspect of this project, which brings together a lot of very, I think, urgent questions that this community is constantly talking about. And I'm going to do it through the realm of musically framed material culture. And in particular, we're going to look at a manuscript collection and some home audio recordings that were made by members of the same family. Essentially, the big argument, the big idea of this book is that this particular group of people, the Anatolian Greeks, who I just defined, working definition, in my mind, they're quite distinct from the rest of the Greek diaspora for one very important reason, that historically, they have always defined their Greekness, and they've continued to define their Greekness 100 years after the end of what they think of as the event that destroyed the world that they come from, in relation to other late Ottoman and post-Ottoman populations, in relation to confessional communities like Muslims, other Orthodox Christians, Levantine Catholics, Jews, etc., in relation to other cultural and ethnic groups, Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Sephardic Jews, etc., rather than defining themselves as Greek in opposition to those groups of people. On its face, this seems like a pretty simple, cut and dried thing, but it is not at all. And historically, this population, both in the post-catastrophe, I'll explain that in a second, context in Greece, and also in the diasporic context here in the United States, historically they have been somewhat apart from the mainstream of Greek identification for these various reasons in their practical lives. And so with this project, I hope to just shed some light on this, and I hope that it provokes some conversations about the inherent fluidity of that thing we call identity, just on the personal level, on the collective level. All right, so I'm going to focus then on the island of Lesvos and its diaspora, as I said. We know from the historical record that the island of Lesvos, as you can see from these photos from the early 20th century, has always had an extraordinarily cosmopolitan musical culture. Rather, let's scratch that, not cosmopolitan, pluralistic, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. Lesvos culturally has, as far as we know, back to Sappho and Alcaeus' time and before, it's always been, by virtue of its geographical location, its wealth. It's a very large island where all kinds of agricultural production is possible that's not possible on a lot of other Greek islands. And it's always had a very diverse population. The people who I have been working with here in the New England area count as their most treasured family heirlooms, again, that speak to their Greekness, their Anatolian Greekness, Arabic calligraphy, verses from the Quran in Arabic calligraphy, that their great-grandfather had bought somewhere and brought home. Ottoman florins that their grandmother wore as a necklace or when she was getting married, etc. Hookahs, water pipes, all these kinds of things. And the musical tradition, Lesvos is really the same situation. I mean, you can see from these photos, European brass band instruments. I particularly love the one on the right. We have the European violin. We have the saduri, which is a Persian instrument that has been used. It's a hammered dulcimer played with two hammers. It's a Persian instrument that has been used for a few hundred years in the Ottoman and then post-Ottoman world. We have a euphonium, very clearly a 19th century European marching band instrument. And then we have these guys who, you can't really see it very well in the photo, but they're toasting each other, and one of them is holding a zurnas, which is a long oboe-like sham, which is associated with the Romani people and is popular from the Balkans all the way to North India. And the guys on the left obviously are in European clothes. The guys on the right are wearing traditional Anatolian costumes. So this is very typical of Lesvos. But we're going to focus on the life and career for most of this presentation of this fellow right here, Konstantinos Nikolaou Kyriakoglou. This is the language, the spelling that they use in English, the family uses in English, which I love that they spelled glow, G-L-O-W. So Kyriakoglou was born in 1888 in the village of Kapi on Lesvos, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more. He was a really extraordinary musician, and he is the patriarch of the family that I'm going to be talking about here. But before I do that, let me define what I mean by intercommunality. I want that to be in our minds. Working definition based on much scholarship by Balkanists and Ottomanists. I'm going to refer to intercommunality in social and musical context as this practical commitment to maintaining relatively harmonious daily relations between a diversity of ethnic, national, and confessional communities for the greater social and material good. I think this is a good working definition of the things that worked from the perspective of everyday people, from what we know from the historical record and from oral tradition, the things that worked really well for most of the people most of the time in the late Ottoman period, where we had this, for those of you who are not familiar with the structure of Ottoman society, generally speaking, a ruling class and elite that were Turkish-speaking Muslims, and then several privileged minorities, meaning they had particular rights and responsibilities because they were people of the book. They belonged to one of the Abrahamic faiths, such as Christianity and Judaism. And of course, you had many, many dozens, if not hundreds, of other distinct ethnic groups and this kind of thing. But Greeks, Armenians, and Sephardic Jews in particular occupied extremely important places in the Ottoman social, political, and economic structure. And in many communities, especially in the big cities like Istanbul, modern-day Thessaloniki, Athens, of course, Volos, Ioannina, all the big cities, Izmir, which we'll talk about, Smyrni, these urban areas were, for the most part, very mixed, and people were in the habit of working together just to get by and to enjoy and to live their lives. And this is nowhere more apparent than in the realm of the arts, especially music, where we know from the historical record most of the recordings, the early recordings of Turkish, Greek, etc. music that were being put out by record labels in the teens and 20s were recorded by these orchestras where you might have a singer well, I'll give you an example. Probably the most famous one that recorded Greek music from Istanbul and the Aegean coast of Turkey in the early 20th century was led by a Turkish-speaking Sephardic Jewish singer, Rosa Eskenazi, who amazingly, especially with that profile, is consistently called even by nationalist Greek musicologists, the patriarchess of Asia Minor Greek song, which delights me to no end. Very, very interesting. Her oud player, short-necked lute, was an Armenian from Istanbul. Her violinist was a half Greek, half Macedonian guy from Thessaloniki. She worked with an Arabic percussionist, I believe. Very typical of the time. Okay? So I mentioned Izmir, which for Greeks in particular, this is an old postcard of the city of Izmir, or Smyrni in Greek, which is about halfway down the Aegean coast of Turkey from Istanbul. For Greeks, historically, Izmir was and still remains the sort of the Platonic ideal, at least now, 100 years after its destruction, remains the Platonic ideal of Anatolian Greekness, of the Greek presence in Asia Minor, partly because it was a majority Christian city, one of the few, certainly in that part of the world. Mostly Greeks, lots and lots of Armenians, also lots of Sephardic Jews, and a fair amount of Muslim Turks, but mostly a Greek and Armenian city. But also because it was held up for a long time as the shining example of these ideals of intercommunality, because not only was it arguably the economic linchpin of much of the late Ottoman world in terms of international trade, it did so by being a very willing and receptive home to not just Ottoman minorities, but a huge amount of European, what we call Levantine Europeans. So people of French, English, Italian especially, those three nationalities, but many more, descent, who lived and worked for generations and generations in and around the city. So it had this vibrantly in-between cultural, political identity. Things came to a head in the early 20th century. Won't go into this in great detail. There's been plenty of fantastic scholarship on this event. But at the conclusion of the Second Greco-Turkish War, at the end of the teens, right after World War II, the Greek army invaded Anatolia to try to make a future Turkish state after the fall of the Ottoman Empire an impossibility. They failed very miserably. Ernest Hemingway was one of the correspondents who wrote about this, by the way, if you want to look up some of his writing. And in retaliation, the victorious new Turkish Republican army led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk drove the Greek army literally into the sea and burnt the city of Izmir, of Smyrna, and a huge amount of people died. This was the conclusion of this long conflict. It precipitated the Armenian genocide, as well as it was in some ways a continuation of it. Again, we won't go into that, but that's the context, and that is the thing that is referred in Greek as η μεγάλη καταστροφή, the great catastrophe, the end of Hellenism and the dream of a united, the dream of the great idea of reuniting all of the Greek-speaking peoples, the Greek-identified peoples, into one modern nation. So this precipitated the greatest refugee crisis that part of the world had ever known. Millions of people displaced, and you might have heard of the population exchange between Greece and Turkey, which was one of the provisions of the Treaty of Lausanne, which ended the conflict, where all of the Orthodox Christians, with some small exceptions, living in Turkey, were repatriated to Greece. Most of their families had been living in Asia Minor for centuries, so they really had no strong connections with Greece per se, and the Muslim population of Greece, with a few exceptions, was repatriated to Turkey. Tremendously disruptive event, and frankly, I find as I say in the book, I find this term population exchange incredibly perverse, because there were all kinds of very productive, real exchanges happening between these populations for centuries and centuries before that politically motivated one. So what I'm going to do now is talk about some musical examples of this ethos of communality, intercommunality. And I'll do so, I just want to set it up theoretically with a couple of terms, and I will not spend much time on this. I want to get to like the music and that stuff. Oh, that's the burning of Smyrna, by the way. So I'm going to, at the risk of, because I know there are some heavyweight classicists in the audience, I'm going to refer to a few terms from the analysis of ancient Greek literature and theater in particular to help us think through this case study. So one is mythos or mythos, obviously the root of the word myth. The other is mimesis or mimesis. And I mean something a little bit different than you might be thinking by both of these. So let's look at mythos first. So based on the work of a few contemporary classicists, Homerists, Richard Martin and Gregory Nagy, I want us to think about this idea of mythos or myth as a narration from memory, a fundamentally rhetorical act of recalling every detail of a truth. This is something that happens a lot in the Iliad and the Odyssey, for example, which is where Martin is talking about it. But I want to push it farther, thanks to Gregory Nagy, and think about mythos in the Anatolian Greek context as the ritual coding of a society's truth values, what a given group of people really believe is fundamental to who they are and what they are and why they are, right? Through narratives, through traditional narratives that can take the form of various types of media. And that brings us to that second term, mimesis, which, again, after Nagy, we're going to think about as the performative, ritually framed reenactment of mythos, of myth, not just stories, but these values that are encoded into behavior, encoded into ritual performance. All right, so we're not talking about kind of, carnivalesque inversion that kind of mimesis, which is generally in, for example, post-colonial studies, the way we think about it. This is something very specific, coming out of Aristotle's Poetics, talking about particularly theater and different modes of artistic performance that are reenacting myth, right? And so I'd like to suggest that the mythos, the myth of the Anatolian Greek musical culture, and culture in general, is this idea of intercommunality, of defining what it means to be an Anatolian Greek through this legacy of give and take, of back and forth, of neighborly relations with others, with different people, with difference, and attraction to, but very, very mindful, consistent, and intentional, creative engagement with difference as a fundamental way of defining selfhood. That's the big argument here, okay? And I'm gonna then suggest, moving more specifically towards music, there's a wonderful British scholar, Georgina Bourne, who speaks in a lot of her work about this idea of relayed creativity, which she defines as the recurrent decomposition, recomposition, and recomposition of art by a series of different agents over time. So this is really essentially what we mean by mimesis in the theatrical sense, right? We all know for example, why did the ancient Greeks ancient playwrights write so many different versions of the same myth? Well, because they had different social and political and moral and intellectual and aesthetic prerogatives at different points in history, writing for a particular audience to explore what it meant to be an Athenian, for example, right? So this is the kind of relayed creativity, building. It's almost in the Bakhtinian, like Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian literary critic, this sense of dialogic narrative storytelling. This is what I mean by mimesis, reenacting these ideas through ritual performance. Oops. Yeah, okay, that's fine. So what we're going to look at are a few different, again, in Bourne's words, musical assemblages, collections of musical activity and artifacts that speak very specifically to a particular place, time, and group of people, very consciously put together. All right? And the last term, I'm going to introduce this term from Ottoman music, sadakat. Sadakat in modern Turkish means a bunch of things, but in the musical context, it is the principle that guides the system known in Ottoman music as meşk, which is the passing down of knowledge from teacher to pupil. So sadakat in that, particularly in music, right? So different lineages of artistic interpretation and production. So sadakat here means faithfulness to a particular complex of philosophical and aesthetic priorities that are never fixed, but are recognizable to people who belong to that lineage, all right, if that makes sense. We can think about it in terms of, for example, in martial arts, different styles of movement, dance, the same thing, right? You can think of it analogs with, language, with different dialects or accents, that kind of thing, all right? Okay, so back to our guy here. So this is, on the left, Michalis, Kyriakoglou, and on the right, Konstantinos. So brothers born in the village of Kapi on the island of Lesvos, the northeastern corner of Lesvos. Konstantinos, born in 1888. Michalis, born, I think, in 1893. They were precociously talented musicians. Their father, though they were an agricultural family, their father sent them both as teenagers to Izmir, to Smyrna, to study music. They both studied Western classical music, learning theory, counterpoint, all the string and brass instruments, piano. They also studied Ottoman music. They were both masters of the makam system, which is the Near Eastern modal equivalent to the Western harmonic system of chords and this kind of thing. We don't need to get into that, although we will necessarily in a minute. So suffice it to say that whereas most of the power and beauty of what we think of as Western music, European-derived music, comes from the particular combination, the vertical stacking of pitches into harmonies and chords and this kind of development. In the Near Eastern tradition, it's a modal tradition in which all of the power and beauty comes from melodic line development horizontally, the way that melodies behave in particular contexts in relation to various drone notes and to rhythmic cycles. So it's a very different approach but in certain ways very similar. So they were very well versed in both of these. They worked, they had a band, 4 guys from their village. The brothers are on the ends. Our guy Konstantinos is on the left with his cornet, his brother Michalis with the valve trombone on the right, and then a violinist and a saduri player. This band, all from Kapi, worked extensively throughout the teens, the 19-teens, on the island of Lesvos, on the Anatolian coast, as well as all over the Balkans. Konstantinos' grandson gave me, his name is Greg Brown. They changed their last name. Are you here, Greg? Greg said he was going to come. He lives in Western Mass. Okay, he's not here. But Greg, who I must thank for this entire project, because he gave me access to all the materials you're gonna experience, also gave me his grandfather's ledger book, which had these meticulous notes. He was a meticulous guy, as you'll see. All these meticulous notes about how much they were paid, on what date, by whom, for what event. So we'll say, like, I don't know, April 15th, we played at the circumcision ceremony for Selim Bey's son, and he paid us however many gold coins or something like this. We just got back from our tour of Macedonia, where we stayed for 3 weeks, and we made this amount of money, played for the Slavs, played for the Greeks, played for the Jews, played for the Turks, etc. This kind of thing. The band all left Lesvos when they saw how the Greco-Turkish War was ending. They left before the destruction of Izmir and came to the Boston area, specifically to Lynn, Massachusetts. And this is another reason I wanted to focus on this material culture stuff in this talk, because it's all about New England. And this band actually, so these 4 guys you see right here, they were an instant hit because there was already a huge number of Anatolian Greeks in New England, particularly in Boston and in New Haven, Connecticut. The New Haven community was primarily Turkish-speaking Greeks from the interior of Turkey, and the Boston community was mostly people from Lesvos and Ayvali and these places. And they worked for about 9 or 10 years, almost nonstop. They played a lot in Providence, apparently. So it's amazing to imagine. They were probably, this band, almost 100 years ago, 90-something years ago, was probably playing at church events and like speakeasies and things just like right down the street from here. And they played, because they didn't just play Greek music and Turkish music, they played a huge amount of European music. They played American pop music of the time. They were able to adapt different kind of like early swing stuff, for example, to this combination. They worked with American musicians as well. And they played a lot in the Greek community. This is a picture from the Sappho Society, which is the Lesbos social society of Lynn, Massachusetts. This is one of the picnics in 1929. So you can see these instruments. From the left to the right, we have the valve trombone, we have the violin, we have another violin, we have, there's a clarinet in here somewhere. We have the laruto, the steel-stringed long-necked lute, which was actually very rare among people from that part of Greece. So it's quite extraordinary. So what we're going to focus on now is a document, or a collection of documents, that Kyriakoglou left behind. And this is how it was presented to me. So this is a book. This is a leather-bound book of about 250 pages of handwritten musical manuscripts. It was compiled by Kyriakoglou in 1906, was when he finished the first volume, and then he made a second volume after he came to the United States. So what this says is, my glasses on. I've almost memorized it, but this is in the handwriting of his son, Nicky, who was born in Lynn, and we'll get to know Licky in a little, not Licky, Licky is my dog's name, Nicky. We'll get to know Nicky a little bit later. It says, "Keep for family history, written by Konstantinos Kyriakoglou before 1910, born 1888, Kapi Mytilini, Greece, parentheses, island. Violin, music, trumpet, trombone, and bass horn. Those are the 4 parts. There's also saduri parts, the dulcimer. Given to me by him to continue in our history." So, as you can see, it's lovingly wrapped in tinfoil, as we call it where I'm from, in Florida. And it's this extraordinary collection of music. This is the title page. As you can see, he's dated it September 23rd, 1906. So this is when he completed the first half. Now, it's a remarkable collection for a whole bunch of reasons. One, it's huge. Like I said, there's about 250 pieces of music in here, maybe, there's 250 pages, so about 150 pieces of music. And this is by far without a doubt, the largest and most complete, I'll explain the complete part in a minute, the largest collection of music written down by hand by a Greek musician from this part of the world at this period of time. Hands down. If there's something else out there, we haven't found it yet, and we don't have any idea about it. There was a second book, supposedly the same size, and with all different music that belonged to Konstantinos' brother, the trombone player, but when he went back to Greece from the U.S. in 1930, because he was so exhausted from being a professional musician during the Roaring '20s that he preferred to move back home and be a subsistence farmer. Which, wow, they must have worked a lot. But he took this other book with him, and when I went to Lesvos, I'm not going to talk about the field work I did on Lesvos for this project, because I've already talked for a long time, and we got to get moving. But his grandson told me that he gave it to a nephew, and the nephew used it to wrap sardines. And so, another great catastrophe. So unfortunately, we don't have that anymore. So it's huge. But it's also extraordinarily remarkable because of what's in it. So here's its contents. So we have, it's basically split into three. It's about 150 pieces. A third of it is what we could really call Greek music, because they're songs with Greek lyrics in Greek-ish styles, which for the most part is the kind of like early 20th century, late 19th century Greek bourgeois, quasi-European type of parlor music, like maybe using Greek rhythms like the kalamatiano, which is a 7-beat rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is not something that's common in European music, but, songs composed to be played by genteel young ladies on the piano on Sunday in the parlor, while prospective grooms are over for coffee, this kind of thing, right? You can imagine. There are some folk pieces, but it's mostly not. There's very little Lesbian folk music, which is quite interesting because we know from family history and from the fact that Konstantinos taught a gigantic repertoire of Anatolian folk music to his son. We know that he played it. We know that his band played it, but he did not notate. He hardly notated any of it. Then we have a third of the collection, which is European music. Like I said, there's all kinds of polkas and tangos and mazurkas, things like that you would play if you were playing for dancing at, for example, the home of an Italian consul or something like that, right? There are also the national marches of all of the major European powers at the time, which tells us also a lot about his clientele. There are snippets from operas. There's one snippet from the March of the Toreadors by Bizet, which is really wonderful. But he just calls it opera. But the interesting part of the collection to me, and what I'm going to talk about, is the Ottoman music. About a third of the collection, there's about 50 pieces, of Ottoman classical music. Art music in the modal maqam system, some of the pieces dating back to the 17th century, a few. Most of them are in the late 18th and 19th century. So thinking about relayed creativity, there are a lot of, I'll show you a couple of examples. Well, first of all, here's a list of some of the pieces that I have identified positively but from working in some Ottoman archives. And you can see there's quite a spread of dates. It's mostly 19th century stuff. There's a few 18th century pieces. Konstantinos, like all of his fellow villagers, was bilingual in Turkish and Greek, and so he wrote the lyrics of a lot of these Ottoman art songs, which are in Ottoman Turkish, which is certainly not mutually intelligible to your average modern Turkish speaker. But he did not write an Ottoman script, so he transliterated the lyrics to a lot of these pieces in Greek. So you can see his Greek versions of some of these are on the left. The phonetic transliteration would be in the middle, and then the Ottoman Turkish original is on the right. So it's pretty close. You can tell even if you speak neither of these languages that he knew what he was doing, but he had a Greek accent, right? But what's really fascinating to me is his collection of notational strategies. And so I want us to think about this book as an essentially performative document in which he's engaging in this creative, it's this process of mimetic relayed creativity, engaging over and over again with this tradition and these different pieces. So on the baseline, his notational strategy, you can see the way that he writes. He spent a lot of time copying from sheet music. So this is clearly, I didn't find the original that he must have copied this from, but this is a very well-known area from an opera by the Athenian composer Theophrastos Sagillaridis, which came out 1912 or something like that. The opera is called Perouzé, very famous Greek opera, and this is one of the big hits called To Paramithis Neraidas, The Mermaid's Tale. Clearly, he wrote it. This is to be played on the piano or on the violin. He also very obviously copied from piano scores. So this was a Logia Glika, Sweet Words. This is a sheet music that was published by an Athenian publishing house in 1904, I believe. And it's very obvious that he copied. Even if you don't read music, if you just look at them, he clearly copied from exactly this piece of sheet music. Well, this is a digital copy that I found on the internet, but you know what I mean. From the original published one. He was a great pianist, like I said, so he obviously maybe he was at somebody's house and they had it, and he just copied it down so he could go home and play it, who knows. There's also, like I said, a lot of Ottoman music, and this is where stuff gets interesting. This is an example of a şarkı, or an art song. You can see he wrote the Ottoman Turkish lyrics in Greek script below. But what I find the most fascinating is the way, like I said, this performative notation that he engages in. And here I'll invoke the work of Christian Trollsgaard, who is a Byzantine music scholar, a chant scholar, who writes about what he calls paradigmatic notation, right? So in musicology and of Western music, we often talk about the difference between prescriptive and descriptive notation. Prescriptive notation being, if you are a classical string player, you're playing in an orchestra, you have your part, it's a prescription for how you're gonna play it. Of course, there is some sadakat involved, of course, like musicians are not machines, and of course your conductor and your particular lineage of being an artist determines how you're gonna interpret, but in the Western tradition, we really do have this focus on the vision of the composer, right? We debate it all the time in musicology, the idea of the author and all this, but it's something we believe in the West, something we believe in. It's not really something that the Ottoman music world cares very much about. Konstantinos clearly doesn't care at all because he does not provide a single authorial attribution to these 150 pieces of music. The only one he does provide is an original composition of his own, which is a fairly nondescript march, which he simply calls Ergon Proton, Opus 1. But what's interesting is that, I mean, he clearly knew who the composers of these pieces were, right? He clearly knew. I mean, there's some cases where he copied from sheet music. There's some cases where he was copying he was writing down some of the most popular Ottoman pieces of his time that everybody who was a serious musician knew, and he had probably heard some of these guys play their compositions in person. He's just not interested, because that's not one of the priorities of this particular school of artistic activity. But the paradigmatic notation is, like I said, is not prescriptive. It's not saying play it exactly this way, nor is it descriptive. It's not a transcription of a performance. Paradigmatic notation is simply a roadmap. It's the skeleton of a melody that it's the performer's job to give flesh and bones and muscle and make move, right? It's telling you what the melodic contours of the piece are, how it goes, how long the phrases are, what the important notes to hit are, where they should be, but individual interpretation is up to the performer, and in the performance context, when you have several people playing this music together, they're all playing the same melody, but it's never in unison. It's what we call melodic heterophony, where everyone's interpreting the melody in slightly different ways, but it works together because you're playing, like I said before, you're playing over this repeating rhythmic cycle and different drone notes that anchor everything. This is the performance practice of Ottoman classical music today. So if you look on the left, this is the skeleton transcription, or notation, I should say, of a very famous peshrev, which is like a prelude in Western music. And on the right is Konstantinos' version of it. Now you can see, just look, again, even if you don't read music, just compare the two, like how much is going on. You can see that Konstantinos' version is much more elaborate, much denser. There's a lot more going on. So what he's doing in all of these transcriptions of his is it's almost as if he is describing, he's transcribing a performance, a live performance. If I don't have time to like play this stuff for you, but it's wild. It's extraordinarily inventive and kind of quirky, and it has a personality. I mean, I spent the better part of a year just playing through the entirety of his collection, just making recordings on my phone of it so I could give them to the family because none of them read music. And sometimes I'd be sitting there in my office in the basement of the Harvard Music Building late at night, and I have all these recordings of myself where I just stop and I go, what? Because it's just remarkably playful and interesting and all that. So, I mean, that's wonderful, and it's interesting and all that. But where it really gets fascinating, to me is here. And this is the last bit from this book that I'll show you. There are several pieces of Ottoman classical music in this collection that he notates more than once. And now, when I realized this, my first thought, because, I just looked at the first phrase and I realized, oh, okay, well, I know that tune. I just saw it a minute ago, or, whenever. My first thought was, okay, he notated 150 melodies. He just repeated himself a few times because, But then when I started to look more closely, I realized that could not possibly be the case because, for one, every time this happens, and it happens several times, where there's two versions of the same piece, they're always right next to each other. Like these two are on facing, the first one is one page, and the second one starts on the next page and then continues. So clearly it's not like he forgot that he had just notated it, because this was a book that he bought bound. It's very clear he just bought this blank thing and just was writing in it like a journal. I like to think of it as a medieval, or Renaissance rather, humanists call it commonplace books, right? These like personalized collections of poetry and quotations and drawings and stuff like this. It's kind of his musical commonplace book. But this is where the relayed creativity comes in and gets very interesting, and it's a trait he passed on to his son, which we'll see in a minute. In all of these cases, the versions of the tunes, they're clearly the same tune, but they read and they sound like transcriptions of two completely different performances by different people of the same tune. They're highly improvisatory. It's like he's writing variations on the tune. It's like I said, it's like he's transcribing a recording, which was impossible at the time, 1906, right? It's like he's transcribing recordings of these long, if you played these at tempo, they're each about 10 minutes long, all right? They're long preludes. And I went through all of these duplicate transcriptions. They're not duplicate notations. They're very different, but they're clearly the same piece. And out of the several pieces that he does twice, there's only one instance where there's an identical phrase between two of the same piece, and it's that one that's in the red box. You can see, even if you don't read music, you can see that he's using the same. It's a quarter note, 2/8 notes, quarter note, 2/8 notes, and it's the same melody. But even that's not identical, because he's if you read music, you'll see that he's done the measure lines differently. And that's because he even wrote these two versions of this piece in different time signatures. One of them is in 2/4, and the other one's in common time, or 4/4. This is crazy. This is extraordinary. I saw this and I was like, what is he? Because, the time signature tells you how to feel, like it tells you where the pulses are. So he's actually even interpreting these tunes in two different usuls, which is the Turkish word for these rhythmic cycles. This is extraordinarily quirky and weird, and there are almost no mistakes. There are almost no mistakes in this collection. He clearly knew what he was doing. His penmanship is beautiful, and as you can see just by looking at it again, they're dense and complex and gorgeous, and this is something that happens over and over again in this collection. So I think it's a beautiful example of all of this stuff in this collection. Again, this Ottoman Greek ideal of engagement with difference, of intercommunality as a defining piece of oneself. Like I didn't point this out before, but there's also a lot of pieces in the collection that are very explicitly associated with other Ottoman ethnic groups and this kind of thing. So it's pretty amazing. All right, so just for a few minutes, we'll turn then to his son. This is Niki Kyriakoglou, on the left in his piano and his hot pants, and on the right with his bouzouki, the long-necked Greek lute that is at the center of Greek popular music. Again, like most things that are held up as archetypes of pure, authentic Greekness, the bouzouki is a combination of Central Asian lute design, Italian mandola design, and it has a Turkish name. So this is who we are as a people. So Niki was born in 1920. Actually, I think Niki was born in 21, so he would have been 100 now, I think. Served in World War II, was a bugler and Morse code technician, but also a very accomplished pianist and bouzouki player. He played all around Lynn and Boston with his dad, and then later with cronies of his. He was a barber, like a lot of traditional Greek musicians. He ran Charlie's Barber Shop in Lynn, Massachusetts. And starting in the 1950s, he bought an old Westcore reel-to-reel tape recorder, and he started recording himself at home. In the 50s, he bought this Westcore reel-to-reel machine, started recording himself on his lunch breaks or at night. So there's a lot of recordings where you hear like his wife, Dottie, who I've gotten to know very well, Dorothea is her name. She's like clattering around in the kitchen, and he's recording himself, and she's like, "Hey, Niki, you want some pasticcio? Or you want moussaka? I got some left over," this kind of thing, right? So in the 1950s, there are all these recordings that he made of popular Greek music of the time, of the 1950s, the post-war kind of Greek pop scene. And they're quite interesting. They're mostly on the bouzouki, the ones in the 50s, not on the piano. And it's clear to me that he's making his own personalized, stripped-down versions of these Greek pop songs, which at the time were recorded just like the great, big band era with big orchestras, with strings and horns, and trying to sound European and jazzy. But he took them and he adapted them to the bouzouki. But he also, speaking of engaging with difference and other things, he played a lot of non-Greek music. Here's a very short example of him playing with some of the employees in his barber shop singing. We got any Italians in the room? Maybe not. Well, if you are Italian, I have it on good authority that you would recognize this song. It's an old hit from the 40s called Marina. And so this is them playing this. You hear that?
Sono innamorato di Marina, una ragazza mora ma carina, ma del mio amore non lo vuol sentire.
Okay, so you get an idea. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. There's also these stripped-down solo bouzouki arrangements of contemporary Greek pop music. Here's a particularly beautiful example. You can really hear Niki's gorgeous, gorgeous voice on this one. This is an old song called Pou na vroi gineka na sou mniazi. Where am I going to find a woman like you? By Nikos Gounaris, one of the great Greek composers. So you get the idea. Clearly a romantic guy. But the most interesting examples from this collection, and again, speaking to this process of personalized relayed creativity and this mimetic engagement with difference in different modes, in different ways. There are all these examples, just like his dad, of him doing multiple versions of the same piece. Though in Niki's case, they're stylistically very different. They don't sound like just the same person playing the same instruments, playing the same tune on two different occasions with a lot of extemporaneous embellishment. They're radically different. So here is one recording that he did in the 1950s. Both of these are from the 50s, actually. Of himself, same thing, bouzouki voice. He's singing a famous song called Apopse Putachalasa. Tonight I trashed the place. And he's doing basically the same kind of This is one of those old zebekiko, you know, the very kind of aggressively masculine, agonistic kind of look at me on the dance floor doing my solo thing, you know? Maybe I'll dance one real quick on the second version. But this is a very Greek pop sounding version, this first one. Whoop. For music people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9. 1. It's a 9-beat cycle. 7, 8, 9, 1. Okay, so you get the idea. Highly melismatic vocal style, very reminiscent of 50s Greek pop music, which was heavily influenced by Turkish music and also by Indian film music in particular, something that we don't often think about. But a lot of the vocal style of 50s pop music, what we think about is skilavika in Greek, the kind of trashy nightclub dog music. It's very directly influenced by Indian film stars singing. But it's this aggressive, kind of modern-sounding zebekiko. It moves forward, which is not the traditional Anatolian way of dancing the zebekiko at all. But then, right around the same time, he recorded another version of this same song, playing the piano, and it almost doesn't sound like a piano. When you first hear it, I played it for all these friends of mine on Lesvos, and they immediately assumed it was a sanduri, the hammered dulcimer, because of the playing style and the tone. And then when he comes in on the chords, they're like, whoa, my God. It sounds like a big, fat, like, lesbian, like, country band, just on the piano. And his diction and his accent even in Greek are so different than that version we just heard. He sounds lesbian. He sounds lesbian. It's gruff and rough. And this is the only recording of his father, Konstantinos, who wrote all the music stuff in that book that we looked at. You can hear him singing background in unison with Nikki. So it's a slower, heavier zebekiko. It's clearly, he's in this space of dance, of like playing Anatolian Greek dance music through this pop song, this Athenian pop song. It's, like I said, it's slow, it's heavy, and it just makes you want to dance. It's like he's inhabiting this completely different means of being, as we would say, the Bourdieuian habitus, like the learned, absorbed ways of being in your body and the world. It's very clear that he was able to switch between these among other modes. So let's listen to that really quick. And I'll show you, I'll dance a little zebekiko. And you'll hear at the very beginning, he even starts with what we call a taksimi, which is an improvisation based on the mode that he's playing in, which is Hijaz. Y'all will tell me. Okay, so Yeah, I know, it's amazing, right? It's incredible. There's like 5 hours of that stuff. It's extraordinary. Okay, so I'll wrap up now. I know I've gone over the 40 minutes. But to conclude, I guess I'll say this has been a tremendously fulfilling experience because I've been able to work with these people, this amazing family of musicians who are still, by the way, so Konstantinos came over from Lesvos in 1919 or whenever it was. His son Nicky, who we just met and heard, played music all the time until his death in the 90s. Greg, Nicky's son, is a really fine guitarist and percussionist. Greg's daughter, Julie, is a wonderful violinist who plays all this music. Greg's first cousin, actually all of the first cousins in that family are all musicians and dancers who play this stuff, among other things. And when I was living in Boston, I lived in Boston for about 15 years, I became very close friends with one of Nicky's nephews, Konstantinos Lambros, who's himself a sanduri player, and he's how I got into all this stuff in the first place. And we played together for many years in a band that played this kind of repertoire, and we did a lot of performances. And one performance, there was a series of performances we did in 2015-16, benefit concerts to raise money for Mytilene General Hospital, which was providing all of the medical relief to the refugees who were coming over from Turkey. And so we had all these profoundly emotional experiences playing for these communities of descendants of Asia Minor refugees, right, in the Boston area, up in Maine, I think we played in New Haven. We did one thing at Yale University, actually, too, where the audience was like a microcosm. It was the post-Ottoman diaspora. It was like half the audience were the descendants of refugees, Greek refugees who came, and the rest of the audience was split between the descendants of Armenian refugees, Turkish-speaking Sephardic Jews, and Turks who heard about this and wanted to come. And it was such these extraordinary experiences being able to do this, what I'm doing now, but just playing music and people dancing together and us talking about these stories and showing pictures of these people. And on a couple of those occasions, we had, 3 members of this family playing together on the stage, and it was truly a wonderful thing. And I'll close by just playing one more. This is a very short audio clip of us playing, I think it was the New Haven fundraiser that we did, or the concert, rather. Playing what we decided was the one piece that was most emblematic of this entire collection, because it just sounds to us like the sound of Smyrni, the sound of Izmir, with our romanticized vision. And of course, it's neither a Greek tune or a Turkish tune or an Armenian or a Jewish tune. It's Polish. It was composed. I can't pronounce the name of it, but in Polish it means farewell to the homeland, and it was composed by this Polish nationalist composer Michał Kleofas Oginski in 1794. Oginski had a lot of contact with the Ottomans as well as with Tsarist Russia, and so this is just to close. This is just a little bit of us playing one of these pieces from this collection, and I can guarantee you this is the very first time that this was played since Konstantinos died, certainly in this style. So we'll just listen to a minute of that, called Polonitsa. So, thank you very much for coming, and I hope you found that interesting. Should I play now? Should I play now, or? So, if you have questions and such, please hang on to them. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to play a little bit of music for you now. So if you have to go, I'm sorry, but you can email me if you want to continue a discussion. It's easy. It's P League, my last name, like under the sea or whatnot, at, trust me, I've never heard any jokes about that before, at fsu.edu. So pleague at fsu.edu. But so now I'll transition over there, and I'll take a minute to make sure everything's in tune, and I'll play for about 20, 25 minutes. I'll play a couple of different things, not necessarily related to this, some different music, some of the Greek music I grew up around, plus one or two other strange things. So. Can you all hear the lute? Does it need to be louder? See if my voice is too loud. Can you hear the lute under it? Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to play. All right. Hold on, let me adjust my strap here. My octopus strap. Nah. So I spent a lot of my childhood, I more or less grew up in this town on the Gulf of Mexico in Pinellas County, Florida, called Tarpon Springs, which the Greeks, of course, know about. For those of you who don't know, Tarpon Springs is, and what shall ever be, the sponge capital of the world. What that means, I mean natural sponges, sea sponges. So my people came to Tarpon Springs, like most of the Greek population, to work in the sponge industry. My family were not divers, but we were merchants and people who sold supplies, diving supplies to the divers, things like air hoses and hardtack and rubber, suits and all kinds of parts for the machines and boats and that kind of stuff. So the vast majority of these divers were from, and this is the first folks came over in 1906 actually, which is the same year that Konstantinos wrote his book. I never thought about that before. But the majority of them came from the island of Kalymnos, which is right off of the coast of Turkey. If you know where Kos is, which has been in the news a lot because of refugee camps, as well as it's a vacation destination, Kalymnos is the bigger island to the north of Kos, not far from Rhodos, from Rhodes. And music from Kalymnos, I grew up with music and oral poetry from Kalymnos. When I say oral poetry, I mean in the Kalymnian tradition, and this is still the case, though this has changed in many parts of Greece. In the Kalymnian tradition, melodies, whether they're dance melody, with some very few, very keenly ritually focused exceptions, melodies, whether it's dance music or not, but particularly for dance music, melodies are vehicles for improvising poetry. So any particular given melody fits different parts of the melody, fit different linguistic models. So poetic meters, rhyme schemes, different stresses. It's a highly complex thing. And so in order to sing these songs, you need to have a repertoire of hundreds, if not thousands, of couplets. These are couplets, like rhyming couplets. You need to have hundreds or thousands of these memorized, and then you slowly learn how to improvise them yourself. And it's formulaic improvisation. It's really composition and performance is the technical term that I prefer. Because it's not it's not freestyle, something like this. It's very, very regulated by, like I said, the demands of rhythm, meter, prosody, and genre, because certain melodies are associated with certain types of emotional states or certain types of subjects. So I'll play an example of, this is a song that this is a tune, a melody that we always play at the beginning of any dance or gathering. We call it kotikos, or the melody from Kos, strangely enough. And the Kalymnians and the Kotes have have quite a bitter rivalry, but I guess we got this song from them, this tune from them. But it's traditionally we sing verses of welcome. So it's the first thing you would sing at a wedding reception or a dance or a party. So I will sing, we'll see what I sing. But we call it kotikos or jala. And you can tell, so this instrument, by the way, is called the laruto, lute, right? Like the English word lute, it's from the Arabic word alud, which means wood, and also means this short-necked lute. This particular instrument, it's the kind that's played on most of the Greek islands. Steel strings, which is a 20th century development. It has frets, like on a guitar, but these frets are tied on with fishing wire, so that I can, it's nylon fishing wire, so that you can move them if you need to, like if the instrument starts to go out of tune, because unlike a guitar, it doesn't have a truss rod in the neck where you can just adjust. And I'm playing it with, traditionally it's supposed to be with an eagle quill, but in North Florida, eagles are hard to come by, so I got helped out by a red-tailed hawk that may or may not have eaten one of my chickens, but it's all right. And I'm not joking about that. So here's Yala. And it's a sirto, actually it's an Isos dance, if anybody knows the Isos and wants to do it. Χίλια καλοσί βρεθεί με Παναγιά μου και πάλι να βρεθούμε. Βαχή του χρόνου τούτο τον καιρό ερημιάλα να ξανανταμώθουμε. Σας τα λέω τα τραούδια, γλάστρες μου με τα λουλούδια. Απόψε η παρέα μας γυαλά ξύζει χιλιάδες άσπρα. Τον καμπό με τα λουλούδα ερημιάλα. Τον ουρανό με τα άστρα. Παναγιά μου, δώκια αέρα στην καρδιά μου. As you may know, sponge diving is an extraordinarily dangerous profession. In fact, if you go to Tarpon Springs and you go to Spongerama, which is the actual name of one of the 30 or so tchotchke shops that sells all kinds of sponges, you can even see a diorama of sponge diving that it was when we were kids, it was like, it was terrifying because it was this really dark room and these dusty dioramas behind glass. There were wax figures, right? And there's like, for example, them putting on, mending the nets or cleaning the sponges, and then there's one of them preparing a special dish that they would, like a preserved meat dish that they would take. There's one of the women like singing as the boat's leaving, and the last one is called The Death of the Sponge Diver, and it's got, and again, these are wax figures, remember, and I'm a small child looking at this. With my cousin would always take us and laugh at us, my older cousin. But they're almost life-size wax figures. And the death of the sponge diver, it's got a sponge diver laid out in the boat. His helmet's off, his skin is gray, and there's blood coming out of his nose and his ears. So he's died of the bends, of decompression sickness, which was a very common casualty among divers. In fact, I grew up around lots and lots of old men who had been divers in their youth and who were paralyzed in one or both legs, or had a withered arm, or couldn't speak because of decompression sickness. So, in fact, there's a little, and I remember in this diorama, there's a little plaque that says, according to National Geographic magazine, the world's most dangerous profession, 1941, because the mortality rate among divers was so high. But Kalimnians, there's a lot of reasons why the Kalimnians, the people from Kalimnos, wound up dominating this industry during the Ottoman times, and then after the development of when the French developed the deep sea pressurized diving suit, the Kalimnians modified it, and there's just something in Kalimnian culture. It's a very high energy, aggressive, kind of crazy culture, I guess I should say. And you can hear that in some of the music. The men sing very, very high-pitched. The music's very frenetic and strange. The way that the time is compressed and expanded is very unique in the world of Greek music. The dancing is very particular. But there's this whole repertoire of songs about divers. And they're always from the perspective, they're never from the perspective of the divers themselves, actually. They're always, the only ones from the perspective of divers are some jolly songs. Like, the Greeks in the audience probably know Dirlada. Oh, Dirlada, Dirlada, right. These kind of songs, which are these nautical kind of work songs that have been popularized by Greek pop musicians. But the Kalimnian repertoire about diving is all very dark. It's songs about death, songs about loneliness, songs about loss, and most of them are supplications to, well, really, thinking about the Greek folk song tradition, to the forces of nature and to the animating spirits of the world not to take these divers away. And like I said, it's a tremendously dangerous profession, and now that, all the Kalimnian, the non-diving Kalimnians, when sponging dried up, so to speak, in the 40s and 50s, you would have thought everybody breathed a sigh of relief, but actually the Kalimnians since they couldn't dive anymore, they took over the bridge painting industry. So if you see people hanging like 500 feet in the air over a bridge, like painting, I guarantee you they are Kalimnian, because they have a monopoly on this industry in the United States and Canada at this point. Yeah. So they can't not be flirting with death. It's just a thing about our culture, I guess. So here's for example, even a lot of the happy dance songs. All the Greeks in the audience, Thalasaki, Thalasaki Armiro, which normally, most Greeks play it like this. For example, like. Thalassa, thalassa τους θαλάσσινους, θαλασσάκι μου, μην τους θαλάσσοδέρνεις, θαλασσάκι μου, φυσάμα ιστραλάκι μου. This is how the Kalimnians play it. Θάλασσα, θάλασσα τους θαλάσσινους, θαλασσάτσι μου, μην τους θαλάσσοδέρνεις, θάλασσα πλατιά, χαμός που είναι η ξενιτιά. Στα όρη βγαίνω και θωρώ τον κόσμο τον προσωρινό, τον κόσμο τον προσωρινό, στα όρη βγαίνω και θωρώ. So this is like a jolly dance song saying, sea, please do not batter the sailors and the divers with your waves. Don't drown them. Rather, please just turn yourself into rose water just for a moment to sprinkle yourself on their borka, forelock, or whatever. I have a borka today, this little curl. And then that little tsakizma that I sang. Sta όρη βγαίνω και θωρώ τον κόσμο τον προσωρινό. I go out on the mountains and I look out over this temporary false world, right? So these are the thoughts of these people who are waiting for the divers to come back, and they would be gone from Easter until October, basically, right? In the Kalimnian context, off the coast of Libya and Egypt, and then here out in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so anyway, here's a very famous song about the divers. It's called Mesta Petrota. Oh, I didn't translate the first thing I sang. Let's see if I can remember. From Jalla, I said, «Χίλια καλώς ευρέθημε και πάλι να βρεθούμε, του χρόνου τούτο τον καιρό να ξανανταμωθούμε». So it's 1,000 times auspicious that we got together tonight, and may we do the same this time next year. And then the second one, I think I sang, «Απόψε η παρέα μας αξίζει χιλιάδες άσπρα, τον γκάμπο με τα λούλουδα, τον ουρανό με τ' άστρα». So our gathering tonight, everyone deserves all the flowers of the plains and all the stars in the sky. Oh, no, I'm sorry. You deserve thousands of silver coins and all the stars in the sky. All right, so here's one. Like I said, we call it Mesta Petrota, or Barba Thodori, who was a sponging captain. And the lyrics are all about, this is one of the few melodies where we pretty much always sing the same lyric, at least the first time. It says, «Της μηχανής το φόρεμα, θα το μαλαματώσω, και στέλνω σου και ραψιλί, ίσως και σε γλιτώσω», which means, I'm going to take your diving suit, and I'm going to cover it with gold, meaning I'm going to get a golden votive offering, like a little talisman with a picture of a gold thing with a diver embossed on it, and I'm going to hang it on the icon of Chirapsili, one of the Virgin Mary avatars in Kalimnos, and pray that she saves you. And there's another one that says, Όταν σου βάλουν φόρεμα, it's the ghost of one of the divers. Όταν σου βάλουν φόρεμα και δώκουν σου την πόση, στέλνω σου την γυράψιλη, ίσως και σε γλιτώσει. So I'll do the same thing when they put the suit on you and they hook up your air hose, right? So I'll just sing a little bit of that. Oh, and for music people, this is a 7-beat rhythm. It's very slow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2. So technically it's a kalimatiano, but we usually don't dance it in Kalimnos. Sometimes.
Της μηχανής το φόρεμα, θα το μαλαματώσω. Στέλνω σου την τσιραψιλή, ίσως και τε γλιτώσω. Καλέ Μπαρμπαθόδωρη, Μπαρμπαθόδωρη, γιατί μας κάνεις το δάρι. Βαχή, όποιος δεν έχει βασανά, ας έρθει να του δώσω. Βαχή, για να μου περισσεύουσει, καράβι να φορτώσω. Βαχή, με στα πέτρωτα, άιντες μες στα πέτρωτα, μες στα πέτρωτα μια χρυσοπέρδικα πέτα. Μες στα πέτρωτα, καλέ μες στα πέτρωτα, μες στα πέτρωτα μια χρυσοπέρδικα πέτα.
Yeah, okay, well, we're going to end. I appreciate your attention. I didn't subject you to the tsabuna, the goatskin bagpipe. Should I just do one quick on the tsabuna? All right. So we'll pipe the program out with this. So my first music, really, I think probably the only time that I really took, I broke a nail. That's fine. It's okay. Well, I don't have time to, I was going to play something on the guitar, but I won't now, so it's fine. Oh, yeah. I don't need the microphone. So my first major musical mentor in the world of Greek music was this old man in Tarpon Springs. Still alive, he's 98 years old. Still playing the bagpipe, but he hooks it up to an air compressor, so he doesn't have to blow into it. Yeah. Skevos Karavokiros is my mentor's name. So he taught me how to do this poetry and all this stuff and play these instruments. So this is the tsabuna. I'm going to stand up and do it because it's called tsabuna, which it's descended from the ancient Greek word symphonia, voices together, because it's a double chantered bag. Like the word symphony just means voices working together. Also etymologically related to the zabogna, the southern Italian bagpipe. And it's called that because it's a double chanter bagpipe. So it has two pipes that you play at the same time. If you've seen pictures of like satyrs and things on ancient Greek vases playing that pipe that's coming out of both sides of their mouth, it's this, except for it has a bag on it, right? And what's cool about the tsabuna is that, so it's only found on the Greek islands. It used to be played on the coast of Asia Minor as well. I was like, what's everybody watching? Like, watching me. Okay, great. My bald spot. Awesome. This instrument is fascinating because it's made out of four main ingredients that any shepherd on a rocky Greek island like Kalimnos has literally in the backyard. So the body of a young goat. So this is where this is the neck. These are the front legs. The back legs are tucked in here. You can see this is the belly button. And this is the inside of the skin. The hair is actually still on here. It's just on the inside. It's turned inside out to hold moisture. So the bag will last longer. So that's ingredient number one. Ingredient number two is the root of an olive tree. This is the water reservoir of an olive tree. So they usually just take one that's died or something, or that's not doing well, because it's naturally curved like this. So they just cut it off and you hollow it. It's hollowed out already for you. It's fantastic. That's also what the blowpipe is made out of. And then cane, like just river cane, like bamboo growing in a little stream or creek. And then everything's held together by beeswax. And then I have a strip of an old T-shirt that I'm using to do this. There's also, it's a dirty secret, there's also a kid's birthday party balloon. There's one of those cut into a piece and glued right on here, so it creates, when I'm blowing, it's kind of like a diaphragm. So when I'm blowing, it opens, and then when I stop blowing to sing, it closes back up so I don't lose as much air. So I'll just show you what this sounds like. I'm not the world's best tsabuna player, but it's fun anyway. So just to show you the contrast, I'll play that song the previous one that I just played, Thalasaki, which the Greeks will know. This is how we do it in the Kalimian tradition. So again, thank you. If you want to hang around afterwards and you want to talk about anything, I'm here, so we can just do it informally, or I can go to the microphone, whatever. Okay, so here's Thalasaki. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Thanks so much for coming. It's awesome to be here with you, and I'm thrilled that we're in the same room together doing this. now one of the reeds doesn't want to work. I tuned it beforehand, but now give me a minute. Sabuna, the reeds have to be wet and warm enough to sound. So usually you fiddle around with it for 45 minutes while everybody's drinking. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'll try to do 10 or 15 seconds. For me neglecting her for so long. Call me Maria, I'll show you. I could have made it on vaudeville, don't you think? One of those guys who threatens to play the instrument but never does. That reminds me of a story.
The